Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's take a look at the book of Judges. This, I have to say, is one of my personal favourites. It's one of the books of the Old Testament in particular that I enjoy reading the most. It's gutsy and gritty and actually really practical in lots of different ways. What I want to do in this video is just to introduce the book in the way that I've been doing in the previous few videos, just to give an outline of its content, show where it sits in the story of Scripture as a whole up to this point, the narrative that begins in Genesis, and to point to a few details that you might like to plunge into if you want to go in a bit more detail and look at this book. The book of Judges picks up the narrative that began way back in the book of Genesis of the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God's fulfillment of his promises to Abraham in Genesis 12. We saw that in the book of Joshua, what you've reached is the climactic initial fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. They are a great nation of people. They're now in the place that God has decreed to give them. His presence is with them in the form of the tabernacle of Moses. The question now is whether they can sustain that blessing, whether they can retain the blessing that God has given to them, and whether they will indeed be a blessing to the nation around us. And so Judges chapter 1 picks up, quote, verse 1, after the death of Joshua, and describes the next 300 or 400 years, basically what happened. And what happened was a fairly sordid and sorry tale of failure. After an initially positive-looking start, the people of Israel failed to complete fully the conquest of the land of Canaan. Instead, they became corrupted by the immorality of Canaan. You could think about what they were supposed to do as they were supposed to bring with them the holiness and the righteousness of the living God, and that holiness was supposed to spread and infuse from the people of Israel into the surrounding nations. But instead what happened was that the ungodliness and corruption and wickedness and idolatry of the nations began to infect the people of Israel themselves. And so this is where you start to see the broad brush connection between the book of Judges and the church in our day. We are supposed to bring the holiness of the living God, and it's supposed to spread from us into the world around us. But instead, all too often, we and the church as a whole, instead of being a distinctive light to the world around us, we are corrupted by the world around us, and far from being a positive example to them, simply swallow the ethical and moral norms of the world around us and become indistinguishable from the world. That's the broad framework within which we can see how the book of Judges has practical relevance for us as a church. Turning to the structure of the book itself, the first chapter and a half or so narrates really the first generation after the death of Joshua. That's where the timeline sort of locates us in verse 1. And there was something of a positive start in the first few verses, but very quickly the people of Israel began to take on the patterns of life that they saw in the world around them. And when that happened, more and more they experienced the judgment of God. Instead of driving out the nations from before them, they were driven back by those nations and ended up stuck at the end of chapter 1 up in the mountains and the hills where the Canaanites had driven them to. And so the first couple of chapters really are a story of initial success and then increasingly abject failure. And you start to see the reason for that failure, the underlying reason at the beginning of chapter 2. The people of God didn't teach the next generation of young people about the faithfulness and righteousness of the living God. You start to see that in chapter 2, verse 10. All that generation were gathered to their fathers. That's the generation that knew Joshua. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And so the problem stems from a failure of that first Joshua generation to pass on what they had learned about the living God to the generations that came after them. I trust that the practical implications of that don't need to be spelled out in too much detail. So that's what you've got in the first couple of chapters. What follows then in chapters 3 all the way through to 16 is a repeating cycle of failure and sin, and then rescue and redemption and rest at the hand of the Lord, which can best be described by just reading the first such cycle which is in chapter 3, verses 7 to 11. I'll just read these verses and then I'll highlight what they're saying and why it's so very important for understanding the structure of the rest of that middle section of the book. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Embedded in those few short verses is a cycle, a 5-fold repeating pattern that repeats itself a total of 12 times throughout this major central section of the book of Judges. The cycle goes like this: sin, judgment, crying out to the Lord, a judge, and then rest. Sin, judgment, cry out to the Lord, judge, rest. Roughly speaking, the people of Israel sinned against the Lord, forgot him, turned to other gods, and so the Lord raised up another nation in judgment against them, who tormented them and oppressed them. The people would cry out to the living God, and in response he raised up a judge, a spirit-anointed warrior leader who would deliver them from the hands of their enemies, and then for a time they would have rest from war and peace among themselves. And that cycle repeats itself again and again and again and again. And that's the cycle that gives the book its name. The name Judges refers to those leaders who judged Israel, that is, who led and protected and defended them. Othniel is the first. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and so on and so forth. And that cycle occurs a total of 12 times in the book of Judges. So what you're seeing here is a number of things. Firstly, you're seeing the repeated foolishness and forgetfulness and unrepentant, in the end, idolatry of the people of Israel, who refuse to learn the lessons of previous generations. You'd think that the generation that was given rest by God, who mercifully delivered them from judgment under the hand of Othniel, their judge, would have learned that lesson and passed it on to the next generation. But no, as soon as Othniel died, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Chapter 3, verse 12. And so this cycle is immensely frustrating, because you start to see again and again and again the people of God make the same mistake over and over and over. What you also see, of course, is the Lord's repeated patience with his people. Despite the fact that they've done this 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times before, 11 times before, by the time they get to the end, the Lord still shows grace and kindness in all kinds of different ways to his people. So the book of Judges is a story about the Lord's faithfulness to his promises, as well as our repeated and foolish sinfulness. And then what happens, as you look at the individual subsections, the narrative of Othniel or Ehud or Shamgar or Deborah and Barak, and so on and so forth, you learn lessons, particular lessons about what is a wise and godly and faithful way to live and what's foolish and ungodly. And the individual sections are well worth looking at in themselves. Even that tiny little section, chapter 3, verse 31, my favourite verse in the whole Bible, about Shamgar, the son of Anath. And so this repeats itself again and again and again, until you get to the long narrative at the end, chapters 13 to 16, the narrative of Samson. And he's the last judge described in this book. Technically, Samuel is a judge as well, but we'll come to him another time. Then you've got the last 5 chapters, 17 through 21, and they describe the social and religious carnage that resulted in the land of Israel during these years. First, the religious chaos, chapters 17 and 18, and then the social and broader national chaos, 19, 20 and 21, that the land of Israel was subject to. And the last verse of the book highlights, in a sense, the problem. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There is a suggestion there that if only we had a king, things would be okay. And yet, as we know, it's not all as simple as that. There was even an experiment with kingship in the book of Judges itself, with Abimelech and his father Gideon, and that experiment with kingship was a catastrophe. And we know from what we've read later in 1 Samuel 8 that the Lord is Israel's king, shouldn't he be enough for them? And so the question arises, well, what kind of king do they need? What kind of king would be the right sort of king for the people of Israel, who would actually preserve them in the long term, to stabilise them against this immorality and ungodliness? And that has an answer both within the narrative of the Old Testament itself, which is answered by the book of Ruth, and of course a broader answer within the story of Scripture as a whole, which is not answered until a young woman gives birth to a child in Bethlehem many, many hundreds of years later. More on that another time. Anyway, hope that's helpful. God bless you, and bye for now.